Hello and welcome to Office Hours by Vic Gardner, our May edition already, if you can believe that. My name is John Kowalski, and I'm part of the marketing team here. Today we have Mr. Noah Morgan. He is our applications specialist, sharing his insight and knowledge with us around visual analysis. Um, just a couple things. If you are unfamiliar with our office hours format, it is a shortened presentation, usually 20, 25 minutes ish. And then the rest of the time is yours, open for questions, discussion. If we need further elaboration, we may lock your microphone to hear your voice. We get tired of hearing our own sometimes. So if you do have a question or comment or a challenge at your own facility that we can assist with, please log it in the chat box, and we'll get to that right after the presentation. We are also recording this. So immediately following, you'll receive an automated marketing message with a link to this recording. Feel free to share it with colleagues. Check it out later this week, next week, whatever works for you. And two, if you come up with any questions, after the fact down the road, you can always just hit reply to any of those marketing messages. It'll come to my team. We'll funnel it to Noah or one of the regional technical specialists, based wherever you are in the world. So with that, Noah, it is all yours, sir. Did I forget anything?
No, I think you covered it all. Thank you.
Okay.
So, like John said, my name is Noah Morgan. I handle the application support for North America. Today we'll be going over visual control of solid colors. So we'll be talking about some different factors that go into visual color analysis and comparisons, how best to do it, the best practices, the standards, and then some of the solutions that Vic Gardner offers to give these defined conditions for making these analysis and comparisons. So without further ado, we find that one of the biggest factors when trying to visually analyze colors and compare them is the light. So whatever light source that can be. We find that our best output of light is usually daylight. That's because it encompasses almost the full spectrum of light in a very evenly distributed curve. But the problems that we've come into is that, outside the weather changes, and that obviously changes how that light is cast upon samples or objects or whatever it is. And then you have the problem with inside lighting. It all depends on which labs have what type of light one lab is using versus another lab, if they're using fluorescent light or tungsten lamps or LED lights. All these factors can change how we visually see samples. So it's really important that when we're describing colors or comparing colors visually, we need to have defined conditions for that. One of the biggest factors there is to have a defined light source. And then here we have a very nice illusion here. So if you look at these the two halves here on the screen, the right side, that blue section appears a little darker than the blue section on the left side. And what you're seeing here is actually an optical illusion. So when we take out those lines, we find that both sides are exactly the same color. But the reason that we're seeing two different colors is really just because of those environmental conditions. So in this case, it's whatever surrounding color is around that blue, it makes us see that blue differently. And so that's just a nice little example for, how different environmental conditions can affect how we're seeing colors. And so this goes over some of the other factors we have. So color perception is subjective. So depending on the age of the person, the gender of the person, or the mood of the person, you can see a color differently. So as an example, if as people get older, your eyes start to deteriorate over time. and so you may not see as clearly, or you may not be able to accurately define, the differences in some colors. It was found that women can actually see a lot more colors and a lot more detail of colors than men can see. So they can differentiate better between some reds and some pinks, whereas to men, we kind of see it all as the same color sometimes. And then your mood is a very important factor. If you're angry, some people say you see red, or green is known as like the calming color. So if you were to take a comparison between two red samples, and you're having a bad day that day, one sample might appear a little redder than the other, but that could just be a factor of your mood being portrayed onto that sample. So a lot of things can change how we see color. Very important is the viewing and illumination conditions. So what angle you're viewing that sample at, what light source you have, where the light source is coming from, what angle the light source is coming from. It's also important to know is that we cannot communicate nor remember colors. So if you have two colors side by side and then you were to switch them quickly, it'll take us a little bit to look at those colors again and decide which one that we originally thought was redder or lighter or whatsoever. Color dependent on the surrounding light and the background. So we saw that in that initial illusion there. Whatever surrounding environmental conditions are, it could have played a role into how we see a color. And lastly, there are objective methods for evaluating colors. So we'll see that here. These are some of the standards across the world for viewing colors and evaluating solid colors visually. And so we see that across the board. So we have ISO 3668, we have ASTM D1729, we have the DIN 6173, and the SAEJ 361. And across all of those, we find a lot of similarities. So we see that the main illuminant across all of them is D65. And what that is that is the artificial daylight that was developed by the CIE. And so that D65, the D stands for daylight, and the 65 stands for 6500 Kelvin, which is the energy output of that light source. So you see that it's pretty standard across the board to use that. And then we have some additional illuminants for metamerism. What that means is it's just an extra way to make sure that a color isn't changing from its standard under different light sources. So it's just using a different light source. So not only your daylight, but also tungsten light, which is like a warm home light that you would have. We see that the levels of illumination is pretty relatively the same across all of them. And then what's really interesting is that these standards are referring to using light booths. If you're unfamiliar with what a light booth is, it's just a type of apparatus that can help you view colors and make comparisons between panels in a very defined way. And we see that in all of these methods here, they all call out for a matte neutral gray surrounding color. That's very important. And we see some of them, in some cases, they even call out the specific values for that gray color, because we don't want to have any influence on surrounding environmental colors playing a role in how we're evaluating our samples. We also see they're very low gloss interiors. That keeps the reflections down from the surrounding environment. And we all see that we see all of them use a diffuser panel in their standards. And so that just makes sure that you get an even distribution of light over the entire surface of a sample. Moving on to some standard illuminants. So these are some of the main standard illuminants that are used. So we have D65, like I mentioned before, and that's daylight. And we see it's a pretty even distribution of all colors across that wavelength there, which is why it's recommended to use most often. We also see tungsten light, which is represented as A. We see it's very strong in the red end of the spectrum, meaning it produces a very warm light, and that's usually found in a lot of homes. And lastly, we have F2, which is our fluorescent light. And we see has spikes in the blue, purple, and green areas. And so, if you've ever seen a fluorescent light in usually a department store or an office building, it usually has that very blue light feel to it. And you can see that in that spectrum there. So why do we have these different illuminants? One of the most important things in a lot of manufacturing is making sure that samples match what their standards are under different light sources. So if you ran into the case where, say you had two parts that were supposed to match to a standard, but one of the parts is made of a different pigment or a different formulation, what you'll find is that when you shine the D65 light on both of the samples, you'll find a match. But when you shine a tungsten light, maybe there's some certain pigmentations in that material that will be activated by the tungsten light, so the red end of the spectrum, and it might make it look a little redder or slightly different. In that case, you'll have a mismatch between your standard and your sample. And that's, this is how you would be able to identify that, is by using the different illuminants to see if they're matching under those different light sources. Here's another example of that. So we have an example of a sample and a standard matching perfectly under daylight and under fluorescent light, which is that F2. But when we look at it with tungsten light, we see that they're slightly different. And that's most likely due to some type of change in the pigmentation or some change along the line that led to the makeup of that material being slightly different. And then in that case, when that different light source that's stronger in the red and yellow region, when it shines on that sample, it excites some of those those pigments, and they appear differently. So for visual evaluation of solid colors, these are some of the defined methods here for looking at those colors and accurately analyzing between those different samples. So we see that we have defined light sources of the D65 light, the A tungsten light, and the F2 and F11 fluorescent lighting. They all use diffused illumination, so that means there's no direct light. It's all diffused light. It's best to do it outside during midday hours, so when the sun is highest in the sky. It's recommended to have a viewing distance of 500 millimeters that correspond to a 10-degree observer. So if you use instrumentation for measuring color, you'll find that a lot of instrumentation for larger samples use a 10-degree observer, and this is just mimicking that visually. And then you want to use an illumination that is perpendicular to your viewing angle or vice versa. Typically what you'll find is a 45-0 setup. So that means your light source is directly overhead of a sample, and then we view it from a 45-degree angle from the side. That way we don't get any of that specular reflection or that gloss that comes from the light and it shines into our eyes. We want to avoid that. That way we can see the full color and not just the white gloss light. And it can be switched around, so you can have a light source coming in from 45 degrees and then view it from directly overhead. So it can be interchangeable in that regard. We also use hue, chroma, and lightness to describe those color differences, and you rank it in that order. So here's that example of the viewing angle. So we see, in this case, we have illumination on the left side. We have illumination at 0. So what that means is the light source is directly overhead. It hits the sample, and that gloss gets reflected right back towards the illumination. And so that avoids us from getting hit with that gloss and not being able to see the true color of the sample. And then on the opposite side, we see it switched around a little bit, where the light then comes in from a 45-degree angle, and then we view it from a 0-degree angle. That's typically done for very large samples when you can't fit a large sample, say like a front bumper of a car. You can't fit it in the light booth all the time. So you could have what's called a luminaire, which is essentially a light booth without the box around it. And then have it set up on a slanted desk so you can view it from a 0-degree angle. All right, and so it's best, these are some of the best practices. So it's best to have a trained and experienced person, someone that has done this in the past or knows, how to really differentiate between some colors that appear very close. You want to avoid eye fatigue effects, so you don't want to view pastel colors after chromatic colors because it could throw off how you're seeing it. You want to make a quick decision, so you don't want to sit there and dwell on, is it too red, or is this one redder than the other? Is it greener than the other? You want to make a quick decision. That way you don't sit there and double guess yourself and get stuck in a situation. It's best to have rest periods. So in between looking at colors, or if you can't make a decision, it's best to stop and just spend some time staring at a gray neutral colored wall. That way you can relax the cone cells that are in your eyes. And then you can see the color better. It's also best to have neutral colored clothing. So it's not recommended to have very bright clothing on. So say like a fluorescent yellow t-shirt on, because it could affect, that it could reflect off of your shirt and then shine on the sample. And then you could see the sample slightly different than under gray neutral surroundings. So you want to keep your environment pretty neutral colored. And then testing is recommended over 40 years. So it's good to have testing on your eyes done. That way you know that you're not colorblind or you're seeing accurately, essentially. And then lastly, it says down there, normal color vision is recommended. So if you're colorblind, it's not recommended to make decisions based off of color analysis, because you can't see color as accurately as some other people.
And there are tests, sorry to interrupt, Noah, but there are tests that can test your, how well you see color. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we touch on that a little further in the presentation, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
Perfect. Yeah, because everyone sees different, and to make an accurate decision, you first need to make sure you personally can see that color accurately. So
yeah, that's exactly right.
Back to you. Thank you.
All righty. Okay, so I have a very cool another optical illusion here. So if you stare at the white dot in the center, just stare at it. We'll give you about 30 seconds ish. Just try to stare at that white dot in the middle without breaking. And this will be a cool example of how our eyes can fatigue over time. And you'll see how our cone cells in our eyes will overpower with the other cone cells. So keep staring at that dot, and I'm going to switch the screen here in a few seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So now if you keep staring in the middle, you should see a red, white, and blue flag for just a couple seconds there. We didn't stare at it too long, so it's not going to linger for a while. But that shows you how our eyes, in this case, we're looking at the green and the yellow of that original flag, and the surrounding peripheral vision of our eyes, they're using the green and the yellow cone cells. But as we change it to a white slide, because our eyes were overly fatigued looking at those specific colors, it then overpowered with a red and blue, which are the opposites of the yellow and green colors. And that's why you might have saw a red, white, and blue flag. It's very interesting. And this is if you have color matching instrumentation, you're probably familiar with some of these values here, but you have basically your LA/B values. So your A value is at negative A, it's a green color, or it's more green, and at positive A, it's redder. And then our B axis here on this color plane, at a positive B, it's yellow, and then at a negative B, it's blue. And then for our other axis here, our L axis, we see that at 0, it is a completely black color, and at 100, it's completely white. So this is essentially the CIE color system here. So where you can tell where you are in color space by the LA and B coordinates. And this is nice because, you know, in some cases, if you're using instrumentation and visual analysis, it's nice to be able to get the numbers with your instrumentation and then relate that to what you're visually seeing. And usually, or almost all the time, what you'll find is that those values for LA and B and your delta E, they correlate exactly to what you see visually. And it's always best, it's good to mention that it's always best to do sample to standard comparisons. So what that means is you're not just comparing, you know, one color to another color, but you're comparing your sample to your standard that you're trying to achieve. All right, so on the colorblind, color deficiencies. So this is one of the tests. It's called the Ishihara test for color deficiency. There's two main types of color deficiencies. There's dichromacy, which only 2 cones are functioning out of the 3. And then there's anomalous trichromacy. And that's where you have 3 cones, but one of the cones is altered. And so with dichromacy, there's most common is red color blindness and then green color blindness. We see approximately 1% of males have red and green color blindness. And for a blue color blindness, it's very rare. And it's usually about 1 to 2 people in 100,000 people. So it's very rare to have a blue color deficiency. And then with our anomalous trichromacy, it's the most popular case. So around 5.9% of males, and that's usually red-green deficiency. And so the Ishihara test is essentially a bunch of these little plates up here. We see the numbers. If you have perfect color vision, you can see the numbers inside of them. For example, the first one on the left is a 35 in the middle. The one in the middle is an 8, and the last one on the right is a 7. If you can't see one of those numbers, then you most likely have a color deficiency. But it's a very interesting test because you can look at these, and if you have perfect color vision, you can clearly see the numbers. But if you had one of these deficiencies, you wouldn't be able to see it as well. All right. And this is one of the other tests, not specifically for color blindness, but this is called the Farnsworth 100Q test. It's essentially a test for people that are involved in color matching or QC and harmony reviews. And it's just to get a good understanding of how well they can see color or to practice seeing small differences in colors. Essentially, it's 100 hues that are very, very slightly. And you have to order them in their differences. It's typically recommended to test 6 to 12 months and to use a light booth when you're doing this. That way, everything is completely controlled under defined conditions. All right, so this is a good example. So if you don't have something like a light booth, this is what you're recommended to follow according to the standards. It's best to find a north-facing window. That way you're getting that diffused light and no direct light. You want to find an uncluttered neutral surrounding. So in this case, we have this image on the left here. We see that the surrounding environment is pretty neutral. It's that gray color to it. The specimens should physically touch each other. So you don't want gaps between your samples. You want them to be right up against each other. That way you can discern between the differences between the two. And then like we spoke of before, it's best to have an illumination of 45 degrees or vice versa. So either the light source is coming in from 45 degrees and you're looking directly overhead, which is what's happening in this picture here, or the light source comes in from overhead and you look at it from 45 degrees. So both are correct. The only issue with this type of setup is that the source of light isn't consistent, right? So depending on the weather, depending on the time of day, you could have differences in that light source. So it's not completely defined. So some of the solutions that Bic Gardner offers are what we call light booths. In this case, we have our Bico Spectra Basic and our Bico Spectra Mini. So these are our baseline models here. And so what they offer is that these two models offer 3 different illuminants that you can use. So you can use the daylight, which is the D65, the tungsten incandescent light, which is your A, and then your fluorescent department store light, which is the F2 or the F11. It's pretty easy to set up. Its assembly takes minutes. All you really do is just build the box around it and then place the light panel on top. And then you have 3 individual switches for each illuminant. So it's pretty simple to use. You just press the switch for whatever light source you want to view. And these are smaller models, so you can see the Mini at the top. They're fairly small in size. So moving on to our other model here, we have the Bico Spectra Light and the Bico Spectra Standard. So these are our standard models here. These models have 5 different illuminants to choose from. So not only do you have your D65, your A, and your fluorescent, but you also have a UV light. So that's nice if you're analyzing fluorescent samples or some of your material has fluorescent properties in it. You can turn that UV feature on. You can see if, say, your standard has a lot of fluorescent properties, but for some reason your sample is not very fluorescent. You can find those differences there. So with the other model, you can only see the regular standard light conditions. With this UV gives you another option to look at some different effects that might be happening. There's also not only just the switches, but you can set up a sequence. So what that means is you can set up essentially a certain amount of time for each light to stay and then automatically switch to a different light source. So if you wanted to compare samples under all the light sources, you could turn it on and program, say you wanted D65 on for 10 seconds and then to switch automatically over to tungsten light, keep that on for 10 seconds and then switch to fluorescent light and so on. So you can set it up so you don't have to take your eyes off the sample and press the buttons. You can just stare at the sample and the light will change automatically. So it's a very nice feature. And lastly, we have our Bico Spectra Pro, which is our premium model here. You see the dimensions internally for it. And this is special because you not only can use it as a light booth, but you can also use it as a luminaire. So earlier I spoke of some examples of if you had a car bumper that couldn't normally fit inside of the booth, you can set it up as a luminaire where you just attach it to the ceiling and it shines down over an angled desk, and you can set the samples on there and then view it from 0 degrees from the side. So that's the different setup options for it. So with these different light booths, we come into the question, how do we simulate the CIE standard illuminants the best? So we have these illuminants that are defined in these standards, but how do we actually create those colors? How do we distribute that light source? And so you'll see these are essentially how well you can replicate these curves. And with our Bico Spectra and our Bico Spectra Pro, they follow those curves almost pretty close to accurate. Here and there you see that slightly differentiates between the two, but for the most part, they're very close to what the defined source is. And you'll find this across almost all other brands as well. They're very close But for D65, we see that it uses fluorescent tubes, and it's not perfect, but it's technically good enough to replicate that D65 light source. But at Bic Gardner, we had the question of, could we make it better? And so, we had the tungsten light and we had the fluorescent light pretty close, but the question was, could we make the D65 light better? So the short answer is yes. How we did that, we used some special halogen lamps with some blue light filters and LED arrays. And we were able to almost perfectly replicate that CIE D65 reflectance curve there. So it got very, very close to it. You can see the normal one over here on the right side didn't match as well, but you see now on the left side with these additional features, it looks a lot better. So how do we classify how well that matches? So with light booths and artificial light sources, there's a rating system called the MI-Viz. It's essentially how well can you replicate these standard light sources. It goes from A to E. Based off of this calculation for the MI-Viz, you can see that our light booth here, our BicoSpectra Pro, based off of 100 of them, so there's a lot of testing that was done, it was found to be a Class A light booth, meaning that it matched the standard light source as best as you can. So with current technology, that is the most accurate D65 light source you can achieve. Using those filtered tungsten halogen lamps and those LEDs, it also had it automatically set the right amount of UV light that real daylight outside would have. So what does that look like? We can see that here. So under real daylight, this is a special metameric sample pair where you can tell under different classes. Essentially a D65 indicator. So if you have a perfect light source for daylight, you should see a perfect match between the top and the bottom of these samples. You see under a Class A, they're almost exactly as natural daylight. But under Class B, because it uses those old fluorescent tubes, you can clearly see a difference between the top and the bottom. So that's what you're getting out of the instrument. So you're not only getting more accurate representation of daylight, but you can be assured that it's a Class A and it's always going to be able to achieve that. And lastly, I just wanted to show some setups for color harmony rooms. This is used a lot in automotive manufacturing. But what you can essentially do is set up a bunch of light booths or luminaires and wire them in series so that you can control essentially the color of a whole room. Basically make a daylight simulator for an entire room or a tungsten light simulator for an entire room. So it's very nice because you can connect them all and put it over an entire car body and see how it looks under those different light sources. And with that is the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to write it down in the chat, and I'll hand it back over to you, John.
Sounds good. Thank you, Noah, and appreciate the thoroughness and all the information. I know it was a lot, folks, but look for that recording that comes your way, and you can always stop it and pause and grab screenshots if you need to. In the chat too, I did throw in a link to our knowledge library, our articles on the website. If you want to dive deeper into, visual color analysis, as well as all the other color appearance, physical test stuff that we do. Also, the color viewing tests that Noah mentioned, the Farnsworth Munsell 100 hue test. I put a link to that. Our sister company, Guardco, does sell that. And I remember it's probably time for me to take it again, but it's been a while. But, it's a real interesting test, because I'm marketing, every once in a while we need to go on a print check with a printer. And, years ago I had it determined that me personally, I couldn't discern, the purples and the blues in that area. So, it's advised, okay, if I'm going on a press check and, something is big blue, that, it's hedging towards that red, that purple, I might want to get someone else to take a look at it, because I know I'm deficient in that area. And though I haven't taken it a couple of years, I probably need to again. So it's a good idea. And, like Noah said, if anyone has any questions, just jot them down in the chat. We're here. Noah's the expert, and we're here to help you. One thought from our side of things as well, visual analysis, looking at samples, versus standards under a light booth or a light box. That's one half of it. We also, definitely prescribe the instrumentation, and we recommend a system or a color program that takes both of those things into account. How someone visually sees it with their own human eye versus the instrumentation, which takes that human element out of it. Noah, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that and what we prescribe here at Vic Gardner.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's so many different factors that can go into how we're seeing color. Not just conditions, but like I mentioned before, even the person, right? And so it's best, in best case scenario, it's always great to have both options. So not only get the measurements with instrumentation, so you have that as a document that you can trust with those specific color values, but you always want to go back and see how those values visually compare to what you're seeing. Because that's the whole idea of it. We're just trying to visually, we're essentially just trying to put numbers to what we see visually. So not only is it good to have a light booth so you can see those differences, but the instrumentation allows you to, keep that data and use it over time, and then understand it and use it for research and development and all sorts of other options. So it's always best to have both.
Yeah, that's good. First question in here, and we might have a stump the Noah question. This is a good one. Christopher writes, I don't seem to have color blindness, but I did have cataract surgery, which replaces my lens. Would you expect that to change how my brain sees color?
That's a great question. I don't know if that would affect how your brain would see. It's very interesting. I wonder if there's been any studies on that. But obviously, prior to surgery, those cataracts would have affected not so much the color, but really just how clearly you could see those. Obviously, it would play a role on it. But I am curious. That's a great question to raise up. Is how from that surgery, how your brain has changed to complete those pathways again and see exactly what you're viewing.
Maybe take a look at that link I threw in the chat of the Munsell 100 hue test, and take a look at that, because I think that would be a good test to start with, just to visually, or just to see how you interpret those colors visually, how you personally see those colors. I think that would be a good start. But yeah, I think you got the question of the day so far, unless anyone beats that one. Hope that helps a little bit. We definitely don't get into the medical side of things, but okay. Another follow-up. I remember when I first had the procedure, for a week or so, my vision was much more brilliant or intense. Eventually, it sort of went back to normal. Interesting.
Yeah. That's actually pretty cool.
It's like your eye, the physicality of your eye was kind of readjusting to that new lens on there. So it'd be interesting, if you end up taking the hue test and get some crazy results or something that's out of the ordinary, I'd love to hear from you, just, from a curiosity standpoint, and, how we can better, help, other folks. I'll throw my, my email in the chat here. Feel free to use it, Christopher. Thank you. There you go. And then let's see, other questions for folks, or, while people are writing in, Noah, are there other issues that you run into? You get a lot of the inbound calls, you work with a lot of customers on their issues. Are there any tips and tricks or things that you want to either highlight that you talked about, or, go into a little further, on how people can visually see color?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, it all comes down to, what are you trying to find out about your samples or your process, or what are you using the color instruments for? Whether you're using it for, say, weathering studies, or if you want to make sure that whatever product that you're making, it's always coming out at the same color. It's always matching the standard perfectly. So we have a lot of instrumentation at Bic Gardner, for different types of color measurement, for just strictly pigmentation without taking into account the surface texture, or just measuring color exactly how our eyes would see it and perceive it. So it's always important that when you're looking for these different options on color instruments and light booths, that you know what you want to look for, because we have all sorts of different technology that can put numbers to what we see, but different aspects of that. So it's just a good piece of information to have whenever you're looking to implement some instrumentation and processes. Right. And something else is, I'll go back to the standards. It's always nice, if you're using these visual comparisons and analyzing things visually, if you haven't already done so, just to get one of these standards. If you're in the US, maybe an ASTM would be better. There's also ISO for international use. But it's always good to have these standards on hand. That way, if you have a question about how you're doing something, or if you have concerns that maybe you're not doing the right procedures correctly, you can always refer to the standards and see, are you using the right light source? Are you doing everything the right way? You're following what a lot of other labs are following. That way, you can always compare apples to apples, say with different facilities or different labs, and everything's under a defined standard condition.
Yep, exactly. That's right. And, in the field too, where's the sun? What time of day is it? Where are you physically located, in the country? That, how tall are you? Because that all affects the angle that you're seeing that sample. So there's all things, those are things to be considered. So standardization, like Noah said, is really the key. So you can replicate that over and over. So you're getting an apples to apples comparison. I know one of our folks in the automotive market, she sometimes needs to stand on a box to see what some of her customers are seeing, and that's the right way to do it, because then you're looking at the right angle, or a consistent angle, I guess I should say that. Do you get a lot of questions, Noah, that people are either doing something incorrectly that you can fill us in on, so people can avoid making those mistakes?
With the light booth, not so much. It's a fairly straightforward piece of equipment. You put your samples in, I mentioned in the presentation that it's best to have the samples touch each other. I know some people I've seen, they put the samples next to each other.
Yeah.
You can still, visually analyze those colors, of course, but it's recommended to have them touch. That way you can really tell the differences. Because like we saw with that first illusion, even a small gap between a sample, or in that case with the illusion, it was the lines between the colors. Those small differences can make big differences with how we visually see things.
Yeah.
Because our brains aren't perfect creatures, they're not perfect like mechanical instruments that exist out there. So small things can make big differences inside our brains.
Yep. That is true. So let's see, as I mentioned, you'll get a automated email with a link to this recording. Check it out. If you have any questions down the road, you can hit reply to any of the marketing stuff. It'll come to my team and we'll route it to the appropriate folks in your area, or to Noah or one of the other technical application specialists here. I think we're going to wrap it up here, unless there's any last minute questions coming in. Any final words of wisdom, Noah?
Final words of wisdom. Yeah, if you have any questions about any type of color question that you could possibly think of, or any type of concerns that you may have about some instruments or processes that you have, or you want to reach out to me and ask if you're doing things the right way, feel free to reach out. My email's up on the screen here. Copy that down, and anytime, always reach out.
No, good. All right. With that, thank you very much for attending, listening to us. Hope you learned something. I always do, and Noah's teaching here, so thank you, Noah, for sharing your expertise and your experience. So with that, we look forward to seeing you on future office hours or our 60 Minutes web seminars, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.